Monaco isn't just another weekend in F1 fantasy. Our chip strategy is completely different. Overtaking's nearly impossible, and the best 2x boost this week isn't even the championship leader.
This is the most important Saturday on the Formula One calendar, and we've got everything that you need for your Formula One fantasy teams.
When we think about Monaco, the biggest factor in F1 fantasy has got to be overtaking. This is a category that's helped boost midfield and backmarker drivers all season, but we're coming up to a circuit that ranked dead last in overtakes each of the last 3 seasons. Now, Terry, Mercedes have been on top all season, but their race starts had been a problem heading into Canada. We started to see some improvement last time out from Kimi, but if Mercedes haven't solved this once and for all, could a Ferrari driver just take the lead and never look back?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think there's quite a few things with overtakes race stars. I still think Ferrari have got a slight advantage. I think it's definitely been eaten into over the past few races, as we've seen. Mercedes definitely got some updates. They definitely made some improvements. It's eaten into that, but I still feel if we look at off the line, McLaren look particularly strong and Ferrari look particularly strong as soon as the lights go off. There is, of course, the factor of straight mode activations, what's going on here, and where Mercedes actually qualify. We joked, on the opening there about Saturday being everything, but the reality is it is. If you've got a Mercedes car that isn't on the front row, is down in the pack somewhere, maybe third row even because something's happened, that Mercedes hasn't got the ability to get to the front like a Ferrari or McLaren may have. So I think it's definitely something we've got to consider. But of course, we ain't going to know that before we lock our teams in and such. So it's going to be a big risk either way, I think.
The low overtaking at Monaco is also going to impact our budget building. Only 2 midfield drivers scored more than 10 fantasy points in Monaco last season, and 3 out of the top 4 budget builders are in Tier B on constructors with multiple DNFs already this season. So without overtakes, it's going to be that much harder to grow our budgets. Here are the top chip options for this week, and they both tie into the low overtaking totals at Monaco. For Limitless, it was the top race to use this chip last season because midfield drivers on normal teams could barely score any points, and that means the gap to Limitless teams was extra big. If most of your team is looking good to go up in value, I like Limitless, but let Canada be a lesson to all of us. If it rains, don't be afraid to hold on to the chip since we could have another disaster at the top of the grid. Terry, I want to ask you about this. If it rains, could we have more teams trying unusual tire strategies since gaining positions in the pits could be their only way to move up?
Yeah, definitely. I think ultimately it's a one-stop race. We've seen that all season. All season it's been a one-stop race, no matter what compounds Pirelli have brought. We haven't had a single race that's really anything bar a default one-stop strategy. So I think that's kind of playing into the team's hands a bit when it comes to what they can do with it. We know that McLaren tried something different. It was a disaster. But I think I tweeted at the time, it was high risk, wasn't it? It was either going to pay off for them and be an absolute winner, or they were going to fall on their sword and what happened happened. The reason they did it was because the cooler element, they just couldn't get the tyres in that window. That's why they went for the intermediates. It wasn't so much the rain. It wasn't so much even a damp track. They realised that they had a problem with getting heat into the tyres. So they thought the best way would be to get on the intermediates, hope for an early safety car with some carnage, because that's what they were banking on. And then they were going to switch into the medium tyres. Then that was their plan as such. Obviously didn't come back because we didn't get that safety car. And obviously they paid the price massively with obviously what happened with Oscar, then obviously later on with Lando. So I think for me, the rain itself doesn't look bad. It looks like we're talking showers here rather than torrential downpour. We're talking potentially a bit on Sunday. Friday seems to be more wet than Saturday. So qualifying itself looks like it's going to be quite a dry day from what I'm seeing so far currently. Obviously taking active interest being there. So I've been following the weather a bit more closely. But for me, I think it's one of those where unless we've got rain, which is proper wet rain that's going to impact on it, we're going to see the same tyre structures being rolled out by all the teams, which is going to be one stop, and it's going to be one in the pits through a faster pit stop. Bear in mind, we have got 22 cars going into the pit lane this time. So if a safety car forces a pit stop, that's going to be really interesting because that pit lane isn't designed for that amount of cars coming in all at once.
And so I think Limitless could be risky if there's rain, but Terry's giving us a sense so far that it might not be as risky as I had first worried. So that's still on the table for a lot of players this week. One other chip that's hard to plan for, but you always have to consider at low overtake circuits is the final fix. If your 2X driver qualifies out of position, and I'd say P4 or lower, and you can afford the pole sitter, I think final fix is a great option here. And this worked out brilliantly for a lot of us at Baku last season. We had Piastri line up P7, we could afford Verstappen in the pole position, and that was a huge differential for us. So, if you decide to use Charles Leclerc, who I'm going to have a lot of supporting information that we should bring into our lineups this week as we go forward in the show, make sure you keep an extra 0.6 million handy so that you can bring in the likes of Kimi Antonelli if that sort of thing happens to him. If you have any questions about the Monaco Grand Prix this weekend, let us know in the comments, and we're going to pick a few of those to read on our Friday Final Thoughts video. The other big story this week is that we have a 2x boost sleeper that always delivers in Monaco, and that's hometown hero Charles Leclerc. On the season, he's P2 in fantasy scoring, and there's a big gap between him and our consensus 2x driver so far in Kimi Antonelli. But this is the week that things could all change, since Kimi really struggled at this race last season. He finished 3 laps behind the leader in 2025, and that hadn't happened since Nikita Mazepin back in 2021, so the struggles here for him were huge. Now, Terry, June 1st is a date we've been waiting for since the rumors started about Mercedes' compression ratio trick back in the offseason. Now that the FIA is testing compression ratios at ambient temperatures and racing conditions, could this bring teams like Ferrari closer to the Silver Arrows?
Um, yes and no. And what I mean by that is I don't think Monaco's the best test for what's coming anyway, because it's not going to be a power driven in the typical sense of what we used to. So I don't even think, even if there was some changes to the engines that we're going to see, I don't think they're going to show up until Barcelona after Monaco. I don't think Monaco's going to show us that. My personal opinion on this hasn't changed since before the start of the season, where I think Mercedes have put the fix in place. They voted this through. They didn't resist it. They let it happen. It's not the fix that the teams wanted in the first place. They wanted a very much a hot test, no cold test, and they wanted it at a much higher temperature than what's currently going to be done at. So I feel it's always been a compromise by the FIA to make it, I hate to say it, but almost look like they're clamping down on something they're not actually clamping down on. So I realize the merit with bringing the test in, but I don't think it's what the teams wanted. And I feel that Mercedes have been on top of this since the season started. They certainly would have been on top of this during that 5-week break, knowing that it's coming anyway. So I think all of the engines are going to pass, no problem at all. And I'm not convinced that Mercedes are getting that much from the engines, what people make out. I think that the W17 is a much more all-rounded car. I think it regens faster rather than the compression we've heard so much about before the season started. So I'm not even convinced it's going to be the great equaliser that everyone's talking about, or certainly hinted to at the start of the season when everyone thought that this regulation would come in, Mercedes would suddenly be pegged back, find themselves P5, P6, everyone else catching. I don't think the other teams have got the engines to compete, as we know that even Ferrari is trying to get extra out with their engines. So with the exception of Red Bull, I don't think anyone's got as powerful engine. So you're clipping something that's at the top of its game anyway, and you've got teams that aren't able to capitalise enough on that advantage backwards. And like I say, I think that Mercedes have done this fix. I think that it was already in place for Australia, and we're going to see a bit of a document come out where it's on the bottom of the Stewards document that says it's absolutely fine, there's no problems at all.
So the compression ratio may not be the key to Ferrari's success this weekend, but it's going to be those race starts and Charles Leclerc's historical form at this circuit that could take Ferrari to the top. And I mentioned Leclerc's form in Monaco previously, so let's dive deeper into that. Last year, he finished second and scored 37 fantasy points, and the year before, he won this race and scored 45 fantasy points. And in both efforts, he won Driver of the Day. And I think if he stands on the podium in this race on Sunday, he's going to take home Driver of the Day for a 3rd straight year. So taking a chance on Leclerc has a ton of upside this week. But not everyone has a great record here. George Russell qualified P14 and finished outside the top 10 in this race last season, and he has never stood on the podium in Monaco. So that means we have 2 Mercedes drivers that are starting on the back foot at the beginning of the week. And finally, Esteban Ocon finished on the podium here in 2023 and has 4 top 10 finishes in Monaco, so he's a great midfield pick once again. Looking at the opening betting lines for this week, our championship leader is tied for P3, and we not only have Charles Leclerc at the top of the list, but last year's winner in Monaco, Lando Norris, is P2. Terry, do you see this more as a sign of Vegas putting their faith in Lando, or is this circuit just not set up well for Mercedes?
For me, I think these betting lines could move slightly. I think that with regards to Mercedes, even when we think back to dominant Mercedes eras, back to Lewis, back in the hybrid era, it wasn't always a happy hunting ground, Monaco, at all. It's not a characteristically track that suits them. So I think that that's shown here in the betting odds. For me, there's a couple of things though. Oscar and Lewis are two sleepers around here, I feel. I feel Lewis's form going into this, he was absolutely brilliant in calendar. I feel he's actually driving the better out of the two Ferrari drivers. Yes, the support will be there for Charles, no doubt about it, but I want to see what Lewis does in practice on Friday. I want to see what he does with that Ferrari, because ultimately, it kind of feels the moves that Ferrari made recently are going more towards Lewis's driving style than what they potentially are to Charles. McLaren just kind of feel like they've not got going at all this season. Very stop-start, very much a we know it's got the Mercedes engine. We know they've had problems. They've had the gremlins they've eked out, but it feels like false storms every race weekend for them. And they are back-to-back constructor champions. They are a team that know what to do. They are a team that can get the most out of that car in terms of what it delivers outside of what the Mercedes power unit gives them. So I feel it's a track that potentially suits them. We know McLaren have gone well here. We know Lando particularly obviously pretty much dominated, didn't he, last year, if I remember rightly, from the race there. So for me, McLaren should be up there, but I think Lewis being where he is, and even potentially offset, and Max as well. I think a lot of people might be sleeping on that Red Bull powertrain engine, and Max Verstappen in qualifying on Saturday.
A couple of big takeaways for me on that is some teams ran McLaren and Ferrari due to cost cap restrictions back in Canada, and they really got burned by that alternative tire strategy to start the race. But I wouldn't give up on McLaren just yet, because I think this could be a big turnaround for them, and that's reflected here in the betting lines. And you made a great point too, Terry, is that this is going to be our first Friday free practice session that we've had in a long time. Only FP1 and the last two sprint races, but we get the benefit of 3 free practices for Monaco. So these betting lines could absolutely shift if one of these teams show up and really put down some flying laps on Friday. As we look further down the grid, let's give it up for Franco Colapinto starting the week in P10. What an amazing season he's had for Alpine, soon to be the Gucci Alpine team next season. And beware of those cost cap builders at the very bottom of the grid here. We have Gabby, Stroll, and Valtteri all at the very back of the grid here. So if they score points this weekend, it's probably because they survived DNFs from the drivers ahead rather than really making a lot of movement from where they start. Now, speaking of cost cap building, here are the price gain targets for Monaco. In Tier A, Kimi has an easy target to gain 0.3 million, and I'm actually okay with Leclerc's 33-point target, because remember, he's scored that each of the last 2 seasons, and Driver of the Day seems very well in hand with him if he finishes in the top 3. And as we look at the upper midfield, Carlos Sainz is 8th in fantasy scoring on the season, and if you can believe it, he's scored 54 of the last 58 championship points for Williams. Terry, we haven't paid a lot of attention to Williams in the last few weeks because they're a bit more expensive in F1 fantasy. But are they finally back to their 2025 form?
I wouldn't say they're back. I think they've definitely made moves in the right direction. I think we've seen that over the past couple of races where that break was what they needed to reset, bring some updates to the car, take some weight off the car, because ultimately that seemed to be their biggest problem. It wasn't the car, it was just too heavy. It just couldn't get where they wanted to. And yeah, we talked about this on the show on a couple of previews ago where James Vowell said quite open and honestly, he said that if we had no cost cap, I could bring the parts tomorrow, we could strip all the weight off it and we'd be fine. So it's clear they've got a plan, and it's clear they've been rolling out that plan bit by bit, and they know exactly where the problems are with that Williams car, and they're getting it back to where it needs to be. For me, I think that it's one of those where they're almost back, but I look at who's in the middle. So I look at the Alpines, I look at even the V-Carbs, I look at the performances of that set of 4 drivers and kind of feel they might dominate that midfield, especially with lack of overtakings that you talked about earlier. So I think qualifying is going to be key for them if they can get a good result in there. They've got 2 really experienced drivers, 2 drivers who know the track really well, 2 drivers who can go well here, so that's obviously going to put them in a good stead. That might give them the advantage over someone like VCarb in terms of the raw pace that they've been lacking recently. So they might be a sleeping bet, but I think ultimately for the price of where Williams are currently priced, it kind of feels like I'm not seeing enough for me to want to bring them in over the likes of the other people that we could easily afford and easily gain budget from, to be honest.
Yeah, fair call on the price. Williams are definitely a bit higher than some of these midfield drivers that have been delivering more for us this year. And of course, Alex Albon, we all counted on him in Canada, and he got punted out of the race by Oscar Piastri. So an unlucky break for him. He's probably going to move to the sell category when we get to our rankings coming up next. Now, moving down the grid, Stroll, Colapinto, and Bottas all have easy targets, but really nothing's guaranteed after that. So for me, I'm looking for drivers to round out my team that are good hold options for Spain. I'm thinking about Liam Lawson, whose Miami DNF is going to fall off of his 3-race average, so he's a good shout. And both Haas drivers should be good in Spain too. So if you're looking for drivers that are a bit safer, good hold candidates for Spain, those are perfectly fine ways to complete your lineup this week. Moving over to the constructor table, these price gain targets are pretty much identical to last week in terms of who we can and can't trust. Mercedes, Ferrari, McLaren all locks in Tier A based on what you can afford. And if you still have to run a Tier B constructor, I'd pick either Alpine or Haas for this one. If you're enjoying the video, make sure to like and subscribe because that tells the YouTube algorithm that you want more F1 fantasy coverage. So make sure to hit that like button. And remember, we have some great bonuses for our members, so if you haven't signed up, it really supports the channel. We had Zach Taylor join during our Canada Live show, so thank you again, Zach. Plus, we have some members that have been with us for over 6 months. That's BZ, Race Maven, Rick, Juicebox, and Francine, so thank you all for your support. Here are our buy and sell rankings for Monaco. Antonelli's on 4 straight wins, and Leclerc's been huge in Monaco the last 2 seasons, so they're the top 2x boost options. Now, a few of you run a second tier A driver, so if you do that, I really like Lewis Hamilton because like Terry said earlier, he's definitely the Ferrari driver that's been in form these last few races, and he also paid off big time for those of you who ran him in Montreal. Over in Tier B, the cost cap quartet of Stroll, Colapinto, Valtteri, and Bortoletto are on top this week, followed by the 2 Haas drivers. Carlos Sainz is on the fence because he cost $12.8 million, so it's just hard to get that sort of production on our team at such a high price point. And Liam Lawson joins him on the fence. Just if you're really looking for cost cap gains, it's going to be hard for him to do that this week with price gain targets at 11 and 18 fantasy points. And you might be a little turned off by some of that Racing Bulls reliability, which has stung their drivers each of the last 2 races. So I'm probably going to run Liam this week, but I understand that he's not for everybody. Terry, I think so much of the success this week is going to depend on how straight modes are laid out for Monaco. And the initial layout of the circuit says that there's going to be none for this week. Does that mean there's going to be an impact to overtakes, or are there certain drivers that could benefit or have a disadvantage?
To be honest, I think the one team that benefits, no doubt, is going to be Ferrari for this. Now, this is where it gets a little bit confusing. So we're going to have to dig a bit into the 2026 tech on this because straight mode activation is where the front and the rear opens on every single car, no matter where they are on the circuit. So not like the traditional DRS, it's not an overtaking mechanism, it's a regen mechanism. So what it does, reduces drag, allows the car greater top speed, let more efficiency so they can regen that engine. Now, obviously, as we know, Ferrari don't need that as much as the others. They got a smaller turbo, it spools up a lot faster, they can get on the power a lot more. So around here, that is going to be key, especially coming out of the corners, especially where the other teams haven't got that advantage of the straight mode activations. Now, the other factor for this is I did an article on this, so I was digging some into the technical regulations because I've read a few things and a couple of it is right, a couple of it is wrong. So the technical regulations say that the rear wing activation has to be on every single car, no matter what. So they can't take it off the car for weight saving, and they can't remove it from the car from Monaco, even though there's no activation for it. So it's going to be on every single car. It's just literally turned off. It's like having DRS on your car and not being able to press the button. That's probably the best way to describe it. However, the technical regulations only stipulate that the rear activation needs to be on there. It says actually that the front activation is optional, which means you could, in theory, bring a complete Monaco spec front wing with no activation on it, knowing there's no straight mode activation, therefore saving waste, therefore making your car a lot better. So whether or not someone's thought of that, whether or not there's enough in somebody's cost cap to actually bring just a front nose specifically for Monaco, we see it with rear wing drag and Monza, places like that. We know that they got steering columns specially designed for Monaco. It's not unheard of, but I feel there's only one, potentially 2 tracks where it's going to be any use. So I'm not too sure whether teams would have done it. But then on the flip side of all of this, we have just seen the cost cap saving from 2 cancelled races where they might have put that development into something else. So for me, the tech updates could be a real key to what someone decides to do, because when you drill into the letter of the technical regulations, the rear wing's got to be there, the front wing is optional. That leaves some options open for teams, which might throw up a few surprises somewhere.
And so while straight line mode's not going to be available in Monaco, is the boost still going to be there? And can teams still get a little bit of overtaking potential just to give us some hope for overtakes this week?
Yeah, so the boost mode is still active on all the cars, so that is still going to be in effect. Now, that's been the one thing that's been enabling overtakes. The front and rear wing activation hasn't been allowing overtakes because, like I say, everyone gets hit, it cancels out. So the one thing that does give us overtakes is actually Circuit Monaco. So I think that's important to remember. I think that because we all keep thinking traditional DRS rear wings opening, that a lot of people are worried it's taken away that ability to overtake. It hasn't. It's limited what the regen's doing, but in theory, they should still have boost mode. But from what I've read, the reality is the start finish rate is too small. the tunnel. They don't want to put any activation in there because as you come out, you've got the chicane and the barriers naturally. And they don't want to do it when there's high load on the tyres. And as we know, Monaco is completely full of high load on every single corner, every single place of the track. So that's the reasons the FIA said that we're not getting any straight mode activation because of all those things.
So the goal is, can we beat the 4 overtakes that we got at this race last year? Keep my fingers crossed that these 2026 regs deliver for us.
But might do it off the start.
Here are the top lineups for the Monaco Grand Prix. And we've got to start with the least owned driver in F1 fantasy at 3%. That's, of course, Lance Stroll. This team has a really strong midfield core with Ocon, Colapinto, and Lawson, with Mercedes, Ferrari, and Antonelli at the 2x spot for $110.7 million. So this team assumes that Mercedes have everything figured out, but we've talked about it throughout the show. That's not necessarily guaranteed. If you have a lower budget, or Mercedes start on the back foot, you can get into something like what we see on the right, with McLaren over Mercedes, Behrman in for Ocon, and Valtteri in for Lawson, and that costs $106.2 million. This next team is going to be one of the most popular pivots for Monaco because you can replace Kimi for Leclerc and Stroll in for one of the Tier B drivers that DNF'd in Canada, and you're still left with a good lineup for points and cost cap without having to take a transfer penalty. The team you see on the screen here costs $108.3 million, but replacing Mercedes with McLaren gets you down to $106.5 million. Last but not least, for you Limitless users out there, if you've waited this long to use the chip, I say go big or go home with Charles Leclerc as the 2x boosted driver, with last year's winner Lando Norris, Hamilton, and both Mercedes. But again, if Mercedes are on the back foot, I'm fine bringing in Verstappen for Russell and the McLaren constructor for Mercedes.
Yeah, and talk about McLaren constructors. This is, of course, their 1000th Grand Prix, so we know they've got a special livery coming. And for me, with this Limitless team, I would just keep an eye on Oscar and keep an eye on Max just to see what's happening on Friday, because it may still just be a different option in there to what we do with the 5th driver. Because whilst I think that this sort of 5 drivers will be the strongest, I still feel that ruling out Max and ruling out Oscar is still a bit of something we should keep an eye on, to be honest. And don't forget, we've got our live show June the 6th, 9 AM Eastern Time, 2 PM UK time, just before qualifying. But I'm afraid, Adam, I think you're flying solo because I will be sat at the track by the swimming pool section, watching the cars go around at that point. And to be honest, I'm not sure I trust the phone signal from there.
I'll be ready to rock, and I hope you all are too. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you on Saturday.